Thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm Rosemary Wrenn, and I'll be facilitating this workshop today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a Jamboard for you to start. Like I have a feeling some of you might have questions that you're ready to ask. And so I have set up a Jamboard for you to make some Post-it notes that you can add your questions, and I'll drop the link in, or you can use the QR code maybe if that will work, and I'll drop that in chat. So if you are familiar with Jamboards, you come over to the little Post-it notes right here, and you can just type your question right on the Post-it note and leave it on the Jamboard for me. You can use the URL here, or you can use the QR code. And as we're waiting for everyone to get signed in, it's an opportunity for you to share the kinds of questions that you'd like to address. This is an audience participation workshop, so we will have some time to have conversations with one another as a small and whole group. And I'm going to take a moment, and we're going to just go ahead and play from one of my students' assignments, perhaps. There we go. So welcome in. And I'm going to give folks about 3 or 4 more minutes to get all signed in. So a little loud. Sorry about that. And if you're done with your question, if you would mind popping in the chat with your name and where you're joining us from today, maybe like your role in education and preparation. The music that I'm sharing with you is actually from an assignment in my children's lit class, where students had to make a playlist for a character. And so this is a playlist for Esperanza in the novel Esperanza Rising. We'll give folks about 1 more minute to sign in, and I love these questions. These are really helpful to guide our conversation. Oh, awesome. Welcome, Mary and Holly. I know there's quite a few from Penn State joining us today, so I'm excited to get to know you and hear from you about how education is working for you in Pennsylvania. All right, so I'm going to go ahead, and the Jamboard will continue to be active throughout our event. So one of the things, you can always come back to this. It's also going to be linked in all the materials that I share with you later on after the workshop. So you will have access to come back to this to take a look at what are some of the topics that we were reflecting on. And oops, sorry, let me get the music down. We'll come back to it later on today when we have a break. I'll play some more of that for you. But also, like I said, I use that as a way to share with you a little bit about how I operate in the classroom too. So you can see that there's some different ways of showing what we know and learn. So if you are just joining us, we have a little Jamboard going with questions that we might want to address during our workshop. And then You can use that. You can either use the link here or the QR code. And once you get settled, if you don't mind sharing your name, your pronouns, where you're from, what you do in education, I'd really appreciate that. Before we get too far along, I wanted to, first I'm going to thank one of my current students, Etta, who is here to facilitate the chat. She's in one of the courses that I teach currently, and she was very gracious to spend the afternoon with us. So she'll be watching chat. If you have any technical issues or anything, let her know. And then we also have Renee Marshall, who is the reason we are able to even run this workshop today. Renee is the person responsible for connecting with educators all over the state of California and putting this on. I don't know if Renee, if you want to say a few words or.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rosemary. We're thrilled to have everybody here today, especially to all of our colleagues who are out of California. It's exciting to be together. Sorry, you can hear the police going right by my house right now as I unmute it. Murphy's Law. But it's wonderful to see everybody here today and to have a collective experience when it comes to this concept of cultivating critical conversations and really, moving forward, having the inspiration to tackle these important conversations, both with our students and with our colleagues, sometimes with leadership on our campuses and in our education systems. So we greatly appreciate everybody here today. Rosemary, Dr. Wrenn, thank you for taking us on this journey and this workshop, and I'm excited for this afternoon. So it's great to see everybody. If by any chance you're not on our listserv and you would like access to additional free professional development, shoot me a message, a private message on chat, and I will make sure to include you. We roll out professional development all the time through Teach Los Angeles, which is a group that I work as a consultant with. So happy to be inclusive. That's what it's about, all of us learning together. So thank you so much, Rosemary. Excited for this afternoon.
Thank you, Renee. And thank you again to everyone for joining us. I'll be doing my best to watch the chat, but I'm famous for not being able to do two things at once on Zoom. So I'll do my best. And like, if you have a question or you need clarification or you want to call me on something, you can also just unmute and interrupt me. I don't have a problem with that at all. So I want to welcome you to this session. I call it We Need to Talk, Cultivating Critical Conversations. And it's something that I take, it's extremely important to me personally and to me philosophically, and to see the future of education in this state and in this country. We need to be having these conversations. And so that's why I spent the time to put this together, because of a lot of the evidence that I see as an educator. And before we even get started, I want to acknowledge, and I hope that you will consider where you're joining from. So I happen to reside on and work in a community that is part of the Yaktichu Tichu Yaktilhini Northern Chumash land. And they are the original, current, and future caretakers of this land. And my home actually sits in a neighborhood that is absolutely stunning and happens to have been the site of one of the largest Chumash settlements in the state. So I think about that every single day. And I think about how I can continue to care for this. And I put a lot of thought and connection into my land acknowledgements. This is not performative. I have built relationship with folks in my community who are part of this heritage, and am looking for ways that I can support beyond just words. And so I'm sharing this with you. This is an image of Fred Collins, who, until he passed away in October very suddenly, was the elder of the Northern Chumash band of the Northern band of the Chumash tribe here locally. And he is responsible, along with his family and tribe, for getting underway the Chumash Heritage National Marine Sanctuary effort to preserve, protect, and enrich this land and this ocean. For those of you from out of state, the marine sanctuary system for California has a hole in it between Monterey and the Channel Islands. And this would connect those two sanctuaries, which would really enrich all three areas. And this particular band of Chumash Indians, their homes, their ancestral home is actually under the water because of the different movements of the ocean and the sea. And it's an ocean going tribe. And so what's special about this sanctuary is it's the first national marine sanctuary proposed by an indigenous people. And so if you're interested in learning more about them, you can check it out here with the QR code. You can check out what's in your area. I take it very seriously because every day that I walk out in my neighborhood, I know I'm walking on land that was cultivated with absolute connection by these folks. And yeah, so this is an exciting opportunity to support the community. I want to start off our workshop with this quote, and Paulo Freire is one of the guiding scholars for my own work, and that is that knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, with the world, and with each other. And what is more being with each other than having conversations? What is more restless than talking about things that are challenging and affect us in so many different ways? And these conversations have to be continuous, ongoing, and reflective and self-reflective. So I hope that you will join me in this endeavor, in being ready to ask some hard questions. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about me. And I want to say from the very start that there's a lot on this slide I see, but I recently completed my doctorate just last year. And my work is in teacher preparation and how do we better prepare our future and current teachers to navigate issues of race, racism, and identity in the classroom. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not an expert. I am a scholar of this work, in particular, this material that we're talking about today. So I would very much appreciate if you have something that you would like to contribute, or you have a question about something I say. I come to you in all humility, and I hope that we can engage in a great conversation today, but I am certainly not the definitive spokesperson for what we're going to talk about today. So I'd appreciate your input. This is kind of our roadmap for where we're going today. If you haven't done so yet and you have the opportunity, please, we'd love to know who you are and where you are joining us from today. I'm going to talk a little bit about Singleton's courageous conversations and some other ways that we can structure and create boundaries in our conversations. What are critical conversations, why they're important, how do we facilitate them with our colleagues and students? And you're going to get to practice some of this today as well. So I hope that you enjoy the ride. So the 4 agreements that we see from Singleton are these: stay engaged, speak your truth, and experience discomfort, and expect and be ready for non-closure. And I'm noticing here that there is another slide that I thought was in here that I need to add in because I think it's going to help us here. So I'm going to add it in there and let's see if it shows up. So these are the 4 agreements that Singleton gives us in Courageous Conversations. And I think in our land of media and social media and instant gratification, we have to remind ourselves of this. And so staying engaged in the conversation, doing what we can, even during this workshop, to avoid the distractions that might be around us, to be willing to speak what we know to be true in our heart and in our mind. And the discomfort part is something that a lot of us really hesitate to dive into. And I think that's what's gotten us to this situation where we have some challenges. And there's not always going to be an answer in the end. We might have to continue the conversation like Ferry tells us. Let me see just a moment. I'm gonna back out of this because I want to share, make sure that we have the other boundaries that, yeah, there we go. Sorry about that. All right, so in addition to those 4 agreements, these are some other things that I like to, another way I like to set up a conversation in a classroom, because I think they're a lot easier to remember, and even very young children can handle this oops, ouch, and whoa. And I want to give credit for this to my colleague, Oscar Navarro, who is currently faculty at Cal State Long Beach in teacher preparation. And I like this because it's a little funny, but it also really hits home and it's pretty straightforward. Oops, I just messed up. I say that a lot because even with all the intentionality that I have, I, as a white cisgender woman, I still make comments that I realize as I'm saying them are inappropriate or can be hurtful to the people I'm with or to my students. So oops is, I just noticed I messed up. I apologize for that. Ouch is, you just said something that made me feel harm. And so that's for a person who's in a conversation and you say something and they say, ouch, they don't need to explain it to you. All you need to hear from them is, you said something that harmed me, and that needs to be enough. You don't go on with that. And woe is, okay, this is getting to be too much for me. I'm observing a conversation that's getting out of control, or I'm in a conversation and I need a timeout. Okay, so those are 3 little guidelines. Those work really well with young children. And then another list of concepts. There's a lot to keep in mind. This is a very reflective practice. This comes from one of the PACE articles, is these FRED values, is freedom of expression, create a respectful environment, and equal treatment, and validate people's opinions. I was mentioning this morning, when we see a young child crying and screaming, and a grown-up around them says, oh honey, you're okay, stop crying. Or you have a young person come to you and say, you know, so-and-so hurt my feelings, they made me feel bad. And we say to that child, oh, you know what, that's no big deal, you're just too sensitive. Well, when we do those things, we're invalidating that person's feelings and that person's experience at that moment. That child would not be screaming if they were okay. There's something wrong. This little one is not coming to you to tell you that someone hurt their feelings, unless that really did happen. And so in these conversations, especially when people are sharing an experience that's so different than our own, we need to accept that as their truth. And that kind of leads into a diversity of ideas. And again, welcoming those things into the space, into the conversation. So I would like, this is our first audience participation. And so I'm asking you to type into the chat. Don't hit enter just yet. But what comes to your mind? What do you think of as critical conversations? Either like what topics, so don't hit enter, but go ahead and type into the chat. And I'm going to give you just a few moments, about 20 seconds, to come up with an idea, and then we'll all hit enter at the same time. Oh, thank you. The live transcription just got requested and turned on. Okay, so if you have your comment ready, we'll go 3, 2, 1 and hit enter, please. And we'll see what it is. All right, cool. Needing to deal with conflict, conversations about race, gender, sexuality, bias, vital, important, help move conversation, move conversation in a positive direction. We acknowledge our privileges and practice cultural humility. So crucial and core to this. Moves us closer to understanding and action. Think more about what you and the other person are saying necessary. Sexuality, they're important to someone, something that needs to be changed. I really appreciate all of those because they really set us up for what I think you're going to find to be some important truths about this. To be mindful and sensitive towards everyone, absolutely. So going to go ahead and start with a definition. And again, this is my definition. These are some things that I have come to consider when I talk about critical conversations, and it's certainly not definitive. So they invite us to inquire, reflect. That should be like in 85 point type, because as you're going to see, when we're talking about working with our teacher candidates and our future educators, reflection is key, because we're going to be talking about critical pedagogy, and that's core to it. If we are not reflecting, we cannot really grow in this area. So they invite us to inquire, reflect, and act in order to better understand and address socially constructed concepts like race, gender, class ability, religion, and all of the elements of our identity. They decenter colonial and white ways of knowing and invite inquiry. And in the earlier session, I broke this out a little bit, but settler colonial ways of knowing and being have really obliterated a space, any room for other ways of thinking. And if we look at how we have in America, on this continent, Western European ideas and ways of knowing were literally like set upon the civilizations and societies that were already here, and literally intentionally wiped out those societies. And so we have a dominant way of knowing and being and doing things in this country that don't necessarily make sense to everyone who is involved in our classrooms, in our education system. And these ways of knowing and being are endemic throughout our whole educational system. And we see this individual competitiveness that is part of it, this bootstraps mentality, this super reliance on quantitative data without context. And we see the negative outcomes of these, not just for our students who are in traditionally underrepresented groups, but also for our white kids who think there's no other way of knowing or being. And so we need to invite in, and ethnic studies is absolutely a vehicle for this, but we need to invite in these different ways of knowing and being, the ones that have been erased, obscured, or omitted from our curriculum and our pedagogy. We need to, the critical conversations also help us to disrupt the status quo of color blindness and color muteness. And I realize these are ableist terms. Unfortunately, they're the terms we have to work with right now. And when we're talking about color blindness, it means that we decide that everybody's equal and that I don't see color. If I don't see color, I don't see my whoever I'm talking with, I don't see who they are. I don't see that part of their identity, which brings with it all sorts of legacy of the way they and their ancestors may have been treated or have had interactions and other experiences. So we need to validate that if we're going to have a conversation, a real conversation with someone. And color muteness is something that was coined by Mika Pollock, when in her study of educators and how they would manage to completely avoid talking about race and not naming race. And I think that we can see what happens when we avoid these things. Anyone who's been conscious for the last few years, it's really exploded. But in reality, the the consequence of not talking and not addressing and seeing people for who they are and their racial identities and what they bring to the table has been going on for a very, very long time. And critical conversations also center on the sources of inequity in our schools and our society in general. So why do we need to have these conversations? Well, for our current and our future students, and for our future teachers, future students. These conversations help to open up pathways in the classroom for folks to have deeper conversations, to get to know one another, to learn how to collaborate. The real world involves working with other humans, especially people who are different from us. And so if we don't understand that when we approach a person whose lived experience is different than our own, that they may have different ways of communicating, we're not going to get anything done. And we won't have effective product to share with a potential client, shall we say, to put it in business terms. So it's really, we're doing a service for our students to teach them and to give them opportunities to practice this. And it develops trust in the classroom. We're, again, not talking about race and other challenging topics makes them worse. I think we have seen that. And I know that my students are expressing to me that they are uncomfortable talking about these things because they haven't had the practice. So we shouldn't be waiting until college to have these conversations. And then this is a good one. Is it right for children to learn about these from TV, social media, radio? Would it not be better to practice these conversations in a space that is about learning, which means it's also about making mistakes and learning from them? So these are some of the whys, and a few more is, I don't know about you, I have college students who are telling me, I didn't learn this in any of my schooling before here, learning about things like redlining and the impact that has on our school systems, learning about Indian boarding schools and the impact that had, Japanese internment camps. Even if you're in California, that's something that's very impactful, especially in the county where we are right now, where there were many Japanese farmers that lost their access to their property, and then the legacy that leaves behind. We also need to have these to develop racial literacy in ourselves and in our future teachers, so that when our future teachers are going into the classrooms where students are from a diverse range of backgrounds, they have some tools and some confidence in engaging in these conversations. I am a white cisgender woman who was raised during the 60s and 70s. Yes, I'm old. And I was not raised with any actual addressing of my own personal identity in the racial realm. So if I am teaching future teachers and I don't have an awareness of my own identity, I'm perpetuating that. And that's how we've gotten where we are, because we do what we know. And so we need to be constantly curious and interrogating our own experience and how we're interacting with our students. And then my personal research was with white women teachers, looking at how they navigate issues of race and identity in the classroom. And both my research and then also some research that we did through the California Council on Teacher Education shows us that in-service teachers are not feeling like they have access or have been properly prepared to navigate issues surrounding race in the classroom. And I will say especially white ones. And so we've had very little practice. We need to, okay, that's the same slide, sorry. So anyhow, so these conversations can lead to building relationships that then build trust and community in our classrooms. In my Introduction to Education course, I've kind of flipped the order of things so that we start out for the very first third of the semester talking about how do we cultivate and interrogate our own identity, our positionality, before we jump into facilitating groups of children. We have to know who we are, especially if we're people who haven't really thought about ourselves as racial entities before. And in order to then build relationships with our students need to know they matter and that they belong in our classrooms. And I say that about our college students, and this is something that we need to convey to our future teachers. Because I recently, just this week, one of my students in their reflection was like, we really need more, we need more teachers that represent a broader range of identities. We need to do something about that. Well, one reason we don't see a very great representation in our teaching force is because our curriculum and our pedagogy are centered on white ways of knowing and white stories being told. And so we have children who enter preschool, enter kindergarten, and they don't see themselves in the curriculum. And their teachers don't appreciate their language, whether that be Hmong or Spanish or Mandarin or any number of languages that they come to us with, and we sit there and say, no, English only. We're not gonna, you're using that your other language as a crutch. You must learn English. And if we're not validating their ways of knowing, if we're not valuing their language and appreciating them for who they are and showing them that they belong in this classroom, why in the world would you think they would want to stay in part of our education system as a teacher? When they're told from the minute they walk in that they need to let go of the things that matter to them in order for them to assimilate into the space that we want them in. So this is really, it's really part of this whole culture that we're building with our students. And we build empathy and we build ways of appreciating one another's thought processes. And I think this also, for me, brings in Rudine Sims Bishop's work on, she talks about it in the context of children's literature, but our children who are coming from a variety of places and have a broader range of identities and the diversity that makes up our classrooms today, we don't just need to do this for the children who have been omitted or overlooked, but our dominant kids, our white kids, need to know that there are other ways, valid, important ways of knowing and being that that are different from theirs, so that they don't get an inflated sense of self. She says it so beautifully. And I appreciate that. And so I want us to think about that we're doing this for all the kids in our classroom. And I'm talking about the kids because that's who our future teachers are going to end up being with and guiding. So another quote from Singleton is that we can create a culture and provide structures that encourage all educators to discuss race openly, honestly, and as safely as possible in the school environment. The welfare of all students, no matter their race, depends on all of us succeeding. And so these are also some comments from Dr. Pollock about how they play into everyday anti-racism. They uncover some of these preconceived, socially programmed, socially constructed beliefs that make us take particular actions towards children. It helps us to explore the tensions in being anti-racist, and it normalizes talking about race, identity, and access. So by normalizing it, we will talk about it more, and thus we will be able to interrogate and make solutions, or try solutions and then try the next thing. It confirms for educators that our everyday acts make a significant difference. And it helps us to develop as a community, so as a faculty or as a cohort of future teachers, a shared knowledge base to support ongoing conversations. And in the last session, I told the students that something that I'm really grateful to my dissertation advisor was the fact that he introduced me to a lot of critical feminist and Black feminist theory that really situates classroom teachers as scholars, as creators of knowledge. Because as classroom teachers, we're constantly asking ourselves the question, how am I going to teach this thing? We create a plan, we test it out, we observe the children, we see how it worked, and then the next time we implement some changes based on the evidence that we got. And so I think also if we elevate our future teachers to realize that they are scholars, they don't need a bunch of extra letters behind their name to be validated as creators of knowledge, just as their children and their future students are going to be. So Singleton's Courageous Conversations, these are the guidelines that he provides us. And getting personal, I encourage you to think of an opportunity to on purpose engage with someone who's different from you as far as their viewpoints. And I'm going to share my own little story here, because I think it's important that we humanize one another in these conversations when we might have very different opinions. And where I live, I happened to be elected to the role of chair of one of the political parties in our county. And as soon as that happened, I called up the chair of the opposing party. And my friend and I invited that person to coffee, and my friends were like, "Are you nuts?" And I said, "No, because I want to know this person as a person before we start getting into the issues." And I start seeing his name in the paper and what they're talking about. And so it was really interesting. I think he was kind of surprised. And we met in his community, in his town. And he brought another guy with him. So me and two white guys. I'm like, I'm 5'2". What are you scared of? But anyhow, it was interesting. I was a little tentative about it, but I asked for this. I'm going to see what happens. We sat there for an hour and a half, and we had this great conversation. I think he really thought I was trying to trick him or something, but I really just wanted to get to know him a little bit better. We found out that we have common heritage. We had a lot of same values with our families and everything. We did not talk about politics. And I left that meeting, and I believe he left that meeting with a mutual respect and an ability to see each other as humans. And then as things heated up, which they did, when I would encounter this person in a meeting or at an event or see something they wrote in the paper, I could say, yes, but I know he loves his family, or yes, but we're both Irish. So I know I've got that in common with him. And so I could separate that issue from the human. And I think that's something we've lost. And that's something that having these critical conversations in our classrooms within the walls of a classroom or in our learning space can really help us to be understand that we can still protect ourselves even if we make ourselves a little vulnerable. So these are some things to keep in mind. And please remember that these are, this is somebody who has dug deeply in it. And I do highly recommend his book. It's part of the resources at the end of the slides, and I'll be giving you all those resources at the end of the workshop. So we can't engage in this work without knowing who we are. If you are a person like me, who happens to be white, who was raised in, like I said, the Cold War years, I didn't really think about a racial identity at all. I mean, I knew I was white, but that was about it. And I didn't understand what that meant, though, or really, I didn't understand about privilege or any of that. And so it really has taken a lot of intentional learning on my part. And do we like to learn about things about ourselves that may not be super wonderful? Probably not. And so it is interesting. When I was coming up with my dissertation idea, my chair was like, well, Rosemary, why do you care about this? And I said, well, I don't know. And he goes, there's your paper. And so I did engage in a lot of autoethnography throughout that process. And the answer is I still don't know exactly, but I did uncover some things that helped me understand how I interact and have, caused me to slow down and think about it. So I encourage you, we're going to do an activity right now where we're going to explore a little bit about our own identities. And if you haven't had the opportunity to do this, there are so many great resources, and I'm going to share some of them with you that I hope that you will dig a little deeper into this. When we are looking at identity and we're looking at critical conversations, we may not have a final answer at the end. It's also important that we're intentional and intrusive. And intrusive doesn't mean getting up into your student's business, but it means continuing to ask the challenging questions, continuing to ask students to inquire and reflect, and don't forget the action part. As educators, we go first. I have a philosophy that I don't ask students to do something I'm not willing to try myself. That's gotten me into some interesting predicaments. But it also, I feel, projects a vulnerability that shows that I am human and that I make mistakes and that I'll try something, and even if it doesn't come out perfectly, I'm willing to try it again. And then we also need to just flat out ask our colleagues to start having these conversations. So as we look at our identity, we need to interrogate this, because depending on the identities that we hold privilege and power in certain spaces, and in other spaces we lack that. And so it's important to understand our positionality in relation to our identities. And a very brief mention of intersectionality, which if you haven't explored, I really recommend that you do. And Kimberly Crenshaw is the person who originated this term. And what it means in a nutshell is, this is one of her descriptions of it. It's a lens in which you can see where power comes and collides, where it interlocks and intersects. And it becomes more than the sum of the parts. It's a synergy that happens when certain parts of our identity interact with one another. And so if you want to learn more about that, she has some there's a lot of resources depending on, scholarly journals to TED Talks to clips of interviews. So I encourage you to explore that a little more deeply. But right now we're going to do that ourselves. So in a moment, you're going to have the opportunity to create your own map of your identity. And I'm taking this very much directly out of work by Liz Kleinrock from a book called Start Here, Start Now. And what she does this with everyone from kindergartners to second graders to college students. And this is something that I've done in my college success studies course and all the way into my teacher preparation courses. So it's something that you can do with children and students of all ages. And basically, I'm going to have you do it in Google Slides. You could print this out on paper, or just flash this up on the screen and have people go to town with their creative version of it. And so these are some key elements of identity, and I'm going to give everyone a few minutes to create their own version of this. And then over here in this little section, if you can just reflect on how the intersection of these influence your interactions in the classroom, or you can talk a little bit about which ones of your identities are most prominent in the classroom, or you don't have to write a reflection at all. And as I said, I always do it first myself. So this is mine that I'm sharing with you. And as you can see, I'm not telling you how old I am, just for fun. So if you have certain elements of your identity that you don't want to reveal, you do not have to reveal them. And if you think of other things that you'd like to add, you will have access to the text tool and you can add them in the little spaces here. But what I'd like you to do is to think, you're going to be thinking about these elements of your identity. And then you will have the opportunity to share out, like we'll share out in the chat or verbally how that went for you. If you're like, are you nuts? I don't know anybody in this room. No way am I putting anything on that screen. You do not have to. But what I invite you to do is if you could take a piece of paper or jot it down on your computer, whatever works for you. If you would engage in the exercise, you do not have to put it on the slide deck at all. So I just want to make sure that you realize I'm not trying to, I don't want you to feel unsafe here at all. So you can follow the QR code, or you can use this tiny URL where it says LARC-identity. And that should take you to some Google Slides where you can just grab a slide and hopefully start working. So, and you can also use pictures if you want to get into it, but I'm not seeing are we able to access that? I will also there's the QR code. Okay, good. I'm seeing a few people show up on it. So just grab any slide. Well, the first one is mine. So if you want to go back to look at it as an example, but there's a lot of slides. There's way more slides than there are people in here.
Rosemary, would you be okay also putting the URL in the chat?
Yeah, let me do that.
I think I see Marquisha's hands up also.
Let me see here. Yeah, Marquisha.
That was gonna be my question, if she could drop the link in the chat.
I was trying, it's messy trying to share at the same time. So let me stop sharing there and let me just drop that in the chat and then I'll go back so you can see the QR code. That's the really long address. I meant to copy that. Okay, I see. It looks like people are getting in there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing because now we have the links in chat. And I'm going to turn my video off and just play music for you all. I'm going to give you about 3 to 5 minutes here to complete that. And then we'll come back. So I'm going to pause the recording. So if you're still working on your slide, that's wonderful and fine. And I invite you to continue reflecting on that. Is there anybody who is interested in sharing theirs or talking about that experience of what it's like to dig into that a little bit? Or how you might use it with your future teachers?
I think part of this also, Rosemary, it reminds me of when we're helping future teachers work on their own personal philosophy. And so I think part of philosophy, we always think it's like kind of grounded up here, but I think it's actually really smart to ground really on what is incredibly tangible, especially as we continue to train teachers. They're going to look different based on the pandemic, based on the social emotional gaps that we're seeing right now. You know, that generation's going to move in. And so I think we're going to really need to be cognizant of that and really like kind of approach training in an even more tangible manner. You know, we've always been modelers, you know, like the people that model, but I think it's going to be even more concrete. So I think using this as something for future teachers is a smart thing to do because it should be at a baseline of all discussions and it should be normalized as a discussion.
Thanks, Renee. And when I did this with my students earlier this year, it was really interesting. It got really quiet. And these were first year, so these were freshmen, undergraduates who were in they're liberal studies majors. And they were all, I've never done this before. And what was interesting to me was you can kind of see this physical uplift that they experience as they're doing it. And even if they don't share with anybody else, it validates who they are. Something about putting it down on paper. And then the other thing that we can do with this, let's say we're working with a cohort of student teachers, and we do this at the beginning of the year, and then we also bring it back either throughout the year or again at the end of the year to see how they express themselves. And that's something that's really, it's really interesting to see in Liz Kleinrock's book, how those evolve throughout the year for little ones. And again, I really believe, like what Renee is saying, is that we need to give our students a lot of tools. And I think by having them work through this themselves, they become more comfortable with bringing it into their own classrooms. So that's one reason that I really advocate for doing all of these things as much as we can. And again, it challenges, for me, it definitely challenges my comfort zone because I share these out with them as well. So before we take a break, I wanted to dive in a little bit into that critical pedagogy. And this is something, as I mentioned, that's a really, it's a big part of what I do. And the more resources that I investigate and the more conversations that I have with other educators is this incredible emphasis on reflection. And I would encourage us to find ways to learn more about it if this is a field that is new to you, because we're hearing a lot about critical race theory. We're hearing a lot about banning certain resources and types of materials in the classroom. And it's really important for us to understand, what does that critical pedagogy, critical race theory, what does critical mean? Critical means inquiring and reflecting on something and not taking things for face value. And so that, again, is something we have to help our students unpack. It challenges this traditional power structure of teacher and learner, and the teacher up here and the learner down here. And in our earlier session, one of the participants indicated their belief was in humanizing education. And one of the things that was really amplified during the pandemic was this difficulty connecting in the online space and how we had to humanize the online space. And part of that is this traditional model of the teacher as all-knowing and the child as this receiver of information. And Freire calls this the banking model, where I'm just going to tell you everything you need to know, and you're just going to soak it in and repeat it back to me. Well, that's not how the world is working. And so if we need to model for our children and our students how to, as teachers, be okay with not always knowing the one answer, with being okay to challenge what we were taught ourselves if something more accurate and more meaningful has come to pass in the meantime. And these are the elements of critical pedagogy that that Milner talks about, which is critical engaged dialogue, race reflective journaling, and intentional introduction of prompts for journal and dialogue. And so we're going to actually have conversations based on a couple of those here in just a moment. So these are some of the questions that we're going to explore a little bit in after the break. But I think what I'm going to do is give us about a 5-minute break, So I'm going to stop sharing. And I hope that I really would like for you to push away from your computer for a moment. If you are physically able to do so, please get up, stretch, reach up tall, touch your toes, turn around, sit down, get up and move away if you can. And if not, sit in your chair and take in a couple deep breaths. And when we come back, I'm inviting you to have some of these conversations with one another. So I'm going to stop the recording and play some music and set my timer for about 5 minutes. I hope that you got a chance to take a deep breath, give yourself a screen break. And if you are here, you don't have to turn your, either if you could turn on your camera or just give me a thumbs up in the reactions, just so I know that we're back. Because oh, awesome. Thank you all so much. I appreciate that. And that'll help as we get started in our conversations here in just a moment. So I thank you all for your patience and for participating. And I'm going to go ahead and we're going to get started in our conversations in just a moment. So before we dive into that, these are some ways that we can guide our students into setting up for meaningful conversations. And I want to give you time for it. So I'm not going to go through every one of these. Something that Renee and I both have found that we have in common over the years is for years we've been using this approach to setting up our classrooms based on the ideas expressed in the tribes program. And one of the key elements of that is a community circle. And all that is sitting down in a group every week, every day, depending on your schedule, and having just basic conversations and asking children, what's your favorite color? And everyone in the circle goes around and shares their favorite color. Or, what's your favorite day of the year? And everyone goes around the circle. They have the opportunity to pass. But the benefit of having these seemingly simple conversations is it sets the expectation that we're going to share personal things about ourselves. And there are so many incredible resources, so many incredible outcomes of this. Number one is it gives children a chance to talk in front of others. Number two, it's validating. It's by letting them speak, by giving them this opportunity to speak in a classroom, their truth becomes knowledge, becomes everybody understanding that that's a part about them that's important. And they start to find commonalities with each other without having to take the risk of going up to another person. They're just like, oh, your favorite color is purple, so is mine. I didn't know that about you. Maybe I can talk to you about that at recess. And the same goes for grownups. And so you establish this pattern of we sit down, we talk to each other once or twice a week or every day if you have that space in your curriculum. We do it in preschool. Why do we stop? Then if something comes up, like there's conflict out on the playground or in the line, or someone says a hateful or hurtful thing in class, it's not weird to sit down and talk about it. We've normalized conversations. We've normalized the way that we talk with one another, that we respect one another, that we listen to one another. And so I really encourage you to check out that this is a link that will take you to the site that talks about more of that program. There's not enough time to talk about that really. Intentionally, as a teacher, coming across things in a textbook that perhaps our district has asked us to share with our students, and we're like, I don't agree with this, or there's something wrong, or this is outdated, and kind of doing that think aloud with our students to normalize asking questions about stuff that's written down. Just because it's in black and white, or just because it's on the internet, we know it's not necessarily true. And so we can model and guide students in the safety of the classroom where learning is happening to test out their own theories and to look into things. Culturally sustaining pedagogies are pretty much the best way to go, in my personal opinion. I don't have enough words to talk about it. And these are pedagogies that sustain and grow children's linguistic, literary, and cultural pluralism. And what does that mean? That means that we bring in different ways of knowing and being and normalize them in our classroom. And so this is beyond the holidays and heroes kind of acknowledgement, where it's all, okay, so it's Black History Month, so we're going to talk about, you know, these 5 people that we talk about every year during Black History Month. It's bringing in who's in your classroom, having the children bring in their stories, their families' stories, their traditions, their ways of knowing, their ways of communicating, validating different languages and encouraging different ways of communicating, even translanguaging, mixing up the languages our students feel comfortable in is so important for them to feel like they are making progress, to feel like they belong. Textured Teaching is a book that I cannot recommend highly enough. Perhaps you've seen it, perhaps you've read it, perhaps you know more about it than I do. It is, it's a book written by Lorena Herman, and she is actually a middle school English teacher. She's part of the Disrupt Text movement, in case you think her name sounds familiar. And she worked with Django Paris and Sami Alim in the developing of culturally sustaining pedagogies. And what her book Textured Teaching does is puts it into a framework that is really, really tangible and helps us to communicate to our students. Case in point, my introduction to teaching students are reading it this week, and we are going to be talking about it and digging deep into it as a foundational way of thinking about our positionality and how we invite in our students' funds of knowledge and weave them into the curriculum, even if we're in a state that has very limiting supposed rules on what can and cannot be taught. Lorena lives in Florida, yet her students are experiencing a richness of curriculum and validation of their funds of knowledge because she is finding ways to weave it in, and they're not that out of the box. So I will leave that leave that for you. And another thing that I love children's literature, I teach a whole course on it. Books at any age. These are just a few of the books that I'd recommend as an opening for conversations. Each of these is linked to to a video of the book. And then this little link here goes to a living list of book recommendations from authors representing a diverse spectrum of identities and ways of knowing. So we're getting ready for our first little conversation here. And I just want to remind you, I think this oops, ouch, and whoa thing is a really good guideline for us to keep in mind as we're having these conversations. And I ask for your grace and your patience. I'll be giving you a question. I'm actually going to give you a choice of 2 questions in just a moment. And we're putting you into pairs, and there might be 3 in a room, but there won't be any more than 3 in a room. And we're going to have, each of you will have 5 minutes. So the first person will share their response to after you introduce one another, each other, you will, the first person will share their response to the question, and the other person is going to do their very best to listen without saying a whole lot. And then partway through, you're going to switch, and the listener will get to ask questions of the speaker. And then we'll start it all over again with the first person, the person who was the listener first gets to do their response. And this is a activity that I adapted from Dr. Allie Michael, who actually was at Penn, I think, to where she did her doctorate. And I actually did this in a keynote that she did, and I was sitting with one of my closest friends, and we shared our response to this question. And this is a person who I'm the same age as, I'd known for many years, grew up in Southern California where I grew up. We were members of the same sorority at different campuses in college. And the biggest difference is that she's Black and I'm white. And we talked about this question that you'll see why there was a very big difference. And I found out things about her that I had no idea. So it'll be interesting. And I know you all are not necessarily with people who you know dearly. And so that's why I'm giving you two options on these questions. And where is I was going to make breakout rooms and I don't see. Oh, there we go. Okay. So the question that I'm going to have you ponder is, in what ways was race talked about in your family growing up? And so this is going to be different depending on who you are and where you grew up. And I hope that you feel comfortable talking about that. And if not, if that's not something you're ready to talk about, if you can think about, how did race factor into your experience in school, and did you see yourself in the curriculum? So those are the two questions I'm going to give you the option as topics for right now. And we'll go into breakout rooms and I'll just send you little messages when it's time to switch. Okay, so I think we may have one group with 3, and I'm going to go ahead and create these and open them, and I'll send you, and I think Etta, let's see, I'm going to move you. I'm going to move this person to, Etta, you're in a room too, but if you want to stay in the big room, you can, or you can participate. So I'm going to go ahead and invite you to join these rooms. If you end up by yourself, or something weird is going on in your room, can come back out to the main room. So first person goes with 2 minutes to talk. So I think we have, okay. Let's make sure we've got a couple people on their own. So I'm gonna give you. It's always a good sign to me when it takes people, like when everybody gets kicked out at once. So, and I know this is certainly not enough time for us to actually have deep conversations, but it's just kind of a little bit of practice with some of the kinds of things. Yeah, and the one this morning, everyone was like, nobody came back until they got kicked out.
No, I'm so sorry. I think I was trying to remove it from my screen, you know, when the box comes up, and
I've done that too. I've actually ended meetings. So welcome back, everyone. And I apologize for the abruptness of any of that, and for cutting you off. I'm assuming there were some conversations going on. And what I would appreciate is, first off, is there anybody who would like to share out verbally about how that went for you, about how, like, did you find out something about yourself? I prefer that you don't share about what your conversation partner told you, but just like a little bit about the experience, either, yeah, so you can just unmute and talk, or.
Hi, I'll start. My name's Denise. I'm from London. I found that really interesting, particularly with everything going on today. And I think about being at primary school and being in London. We learn a lot about the royal family, or the Stone Age, or the Iron Age, and when it comes to learning about anything other than that, it goes straight on to slavery. And it's just really interesting that, like, my son who's Black, obviously, he then is sort of like in the same kind of pitch that, you know, in school, they love talking about the Romans and they love talking about the Egyptians, and they don't consider the Egyptians as the Egyptians, if we're going to cover it, is okay because they're even though they're from Africa, they're not, they don't look what they would perceive as an African. And so it's really hard trying to sculpt it's the identity. So I'm sure that even though he has Black teachers, it's not quite the same, because I have to still do a lot of the Black history for him, and still he will still say things that, like, trying to explain why doesn't this, you know, why does my teacher look like this, or why did my, and you're still having to explain, okay, because of this. So it's quite a hard thing to be still discussing. And like, I mean, we're really lucky in the UK. We do have, well, one program that will have like Black history in it, and it's not like every, like, it actually is. It's like every history month there is a Black program on, and then it's sort of like then we're folded away and put in the box until, and dusted off maybe until next year. And so it's one of those things. Is like, if it's going to happen, it should happen every year. You know, it should happen throughout the year. And, you know, but the thing is, I think there are some really good things that they do in his primary school, where they have like International Day, where they will bring in food, and there's constant sort of like languages and welcoming. But I think it still has loads of like challenges, and just like you do in America with like the critical race theory, we have the same kind of thing, but ours is more hidden. Our government sort of like really cares about doing history in terms of like William Shakespeare, and so they want to remove William's, you know, have William Shakespeare and then remove anything of Blackness. So it's a real dichotomy, isn't it? It's like, how do you get that balance?
Wow, thank you so much, Denise, for sharing that. And I think, first off, thank you for joining us from so far away, and also for bringing in this perspective that really illustrates this is not just something that we have to talk about in America, but internationally. And, you know, Great Britain being one of the most prolific colonizers also, and looking at how, and I do not know much at all about the curriculum in Great Britain, but what you're saying about, you know, we focus on Shakespeare, we focus on the Romans, and then we jump into slavery, and we pull out these programs during certain times of the year, and then we fold them up and put them away. And that's what we're trying to build off of. So those are good starting points, because I would argue that when I was in elementary school here, we didn't even have the Black History Month, or the Latinx History Month. We just didn't talk about it at all. And so we're growing, and we've had this multicultural education and this multicultural curriculum, but we need to go beyond that. We need to go and now integrate these ways of knowing and these stories throughout the year and normalize it. We've normalized the settler colonial approach to education, and now we need to say, wait a minute, that's clearly not serving our students. And I could go in, and I think a lot of you probably understand the grave implications that not seeing ourselves represented in the literature and the curriculum has on children and on their mental health. And not just like race is not the only element of identity that we need to unpack here. It's also gender identity. That's something we've been talking about in that we can use if you have a hard time getting rolling on it with your students. Is there are a lot of books out there now that share a character's journey that help us to open it up into the classroom. And an issue that comes up in my class is there's a book called I Am Jazz, which is a story about a young child who realizes they're transgender, and it's their story from this young person's perspective. And we have, and if you're in Florida right now, or Texas, well, Florida, I'm pretty sure you probably would have an issue trying to share this book. But the question I ask children is, do you think children are like, would you share this book in your classroom? And some people, because some people have said that children are too young, you can't share this until they're a certain age because you're going to confuse them. And so I'll turn it around and ask the question of, what about the children in your class who are having these thoughts, who are questioning, why am I a weirdo? Why don't I belong? People tell me I'm a girl, but I know I'm a boy. And if children don't have that opportunity to see that that's a valid struggle, then we see the challenges and the self-harm that evolves from there. That's really scary, which is what is really frightening about this legislation that we're seeing. And so we have confused children already in our classrooms, because we have children who are asking these questions of themselves already. And if we normalize it through bringing it into the curriculum and having conversations about it, we're not only helping the child who has those questions, but we're helping their classmates who may not have thought that there's any other way to be but the way they are. And now they're understanding that there are valid ways of knowing and being. Markeisha, I'm hoping I'm saying your name right. You have your hand up?
Yes. So initially I was going to speak on my conversation with my partner because we had an interesting conversation where I explained to her that my grandmother and my mother migrated from Louisiana to California back in the day. But before then, my grandmother and my mother both worked in fields. What's ironic about that is that although we lived in lower income area, my grandmother had 8 kids and they all went to college.
Wow.
She was a nurse and she worked a full-time job for the government. And my mother had 6 kids and she made sure that all of us graduated high school and had an opportunity to attend college. I ended up in a predominantly white school back in high school where all of my classmates were extremely surprised that my mom had a government job and could take care of 6 kids on her own. And they never could understand how this Black girl was so smart and had such high grades in class when she was bussed every day.
Mm-hmm.
But we did celebrate Black History Month. We did celebrate. My mom actually made sure that we celebrated every holiday, Cinco de Mayo, St. Patrick's Day. But not only did we celebrate it, we understood what the holiday was for. She educated us on the Egyptians, on the Pilgrims, on the indigenous people. She told us that if we're going to celebrate something, then we should know what it's for and who these people are. And when I became an educator, I made sure that it was important for my students to understand why we were celebrating these. When I became a parent, I made sure that my son understood why we were celebrating these days. And I also made sure that my students understood that who they were as a person, if they felt any type of way or were afraid or ashamed, that my door was an open door for them to express who they were. In Nevada, they don't include Black History Month in the curriculum. I just found that out. My son is 6. And when I asked him about Black History Month, he was like, well, Miss Watson didn't tell us anything. We learned about somebody they learned about. And I was like, well, what did they look like? And he said, well, mommy, they look like me. And I said, well, what did they do? He said, we never got to finish talking about them. So when I asked her about it, she who is a Black teacher, told me that they do not include Black History Month in their curriculum. But LGBTQ identity was a huge part of their curriculum. And I expressed to her that as a parent, I don't want to introduce my child to that. As an educator, I won't introduce it to my students, but if it is ever brought into my classroom, I will address it. And I feel like that's how it should be represented in the educational field. Because, and I hate to say this, because me and my girlfriend talked about it. And I explained to her that I don't want my child to feel like they should be ashamed of who they are, but I want to cross that bridge when they get there. I don't want to force identity, sexuality, anything on my child, because I don't self-identify. I don't identify as gay, lesbian, bisexual, any of that. So if my child decides that they don't want to identify, then that's their personal preference, but I want them to bring it to me. I don't want to bring it to them and then it confuses them. And then working in the elementary field, I definitely don't want to impose or make any family feel uncomfortable. So, and this is just my personal, belief. I don't want to offend anybody. I just think that as an educator, some things have to be tiptoed around based on the world that we live in. Religion, sexuality, identity is very touchy subjects. So we should allow the child to bring it to us, unless we see something, we see a problem, a kid is being bullied, harassed or something, and then we address it. But that's my prerogative. And I'm not trying to step on anybody's toes or anything like that, but I feel like that would be the best approach.
I really appreciate your sharing that with us. And there's so much there, and we don't have the whole, it could take a while to really unpack everything there. But I think I really appreciate you sharing your perspective on that. And I do think it's important, and you clearly have a strong sense of the community in which you are teaching, and where your child is in school, and where you're interacting with the community and your family and your friends. And that is really important. And that building these relationships is core to any teaching experience. And so as we get to know who's in our room, as we understand their belief systems and their value systems, and I would also point out that when we share stories, and whether it's through the curriculum or read alouds or whatever, it's normalizing sharing those stories. And that's what I encourage you to consider. And I certainly would hope that you take from this workshop what works for you, and to communicate with your colleagues and your administration and your community about the kinds of things that go on in your classroom, and definitely keeping the lines of communication open with families and parents. So if you do have a curricular item or a story you're going to share that does not fit with their values or the way that they want to talk about things with their own child, that they know ahead of time, and so that you can work something out for them as far as participating or not in that particular activity. So I thank you so much for sharing your perspective, and I appreciate and I'm grateful that you are in this group and that we can hear from you and that you feel comfortable sharing that, because that's really, we don't all have to agree on exactly how we're going to approach this. I mean, in fact, there is no one way to approach this. We have to look at these situations and consider the context and the spaces that we're in. And I do, I'll share it. I'll share Holly's surprise that, surprised, not surprised that Black History Month is not something that is centered in various places, because I am not surprised, because we know that depending on the community that we're in, and depending on the social dynamics and the political dynamics, that we're going to run into these things. Something that's ridiculously ironic in my county, for example, is one of the most restrictive school districts that actually has a quote unquote anti-CRT resolution, is one of 2 high schools in the county that has an ethnic studies course. So you never know, like, your community, but it's always good to ask, and it's always good to try things that you feel your students need. And that ethnic studies class, for example, came out of a need that the teacher saw and the kids were asking for, and they have done incredible things as a result of that class. So it is absolutely 100% important to know your community, to understand your capacity as an educator, And also what I also like, Markeisha, that you were talking about, you know, you're dealing with the role of being a parent, of being an educator, and juggling all of these different things, and your insight as an educator and your knowledge and your wisdom as an educator in the family space and also in the school space. So yeah, I would love to sit down and chat with you and learn more about your experience, because you also brought up the issue that you had classmates who thought it was unusual that your mom was supporting your family and had a career level job and all of that. And I mean, that's the kind of thing, the kinds of biases that we see in educators too, when we have, I just had another student yesterday tell me that they were told, don't bother taking AP classes because people like you don't go to college. Okay. One of a couple actually of my colleagues in my graduate cohort were told the same thing. People like you work at McDonald's, you don't need to take AP classes. And so those are the kinds of things we need to disrupt. And those are the kinds of things we need to disprove. And we need to have these high expectations for kids. And that gets into a whole nother realm. But having these conversations where kids can lay out on the table a little bit more about one another, they can get to appreciate even from someone who's very different from them, that they have commonality and that they have a way of connecting. So thank you so much for sharing that. Is there anybody else who would like to share a reflection or insight that you gained from engaging in the conversations?
I'll just share briefly that I grew up in a household that like really tried to emphasize that like somebody's race wasn't really determinant of anything else. And so it was like helpful in trying to like individualize folks, but it was also really unhelpful when things clearly had race as part of like what was going on in a situation. And so I'll date myself by saying, as like a kid at the dinner table having a conversation with my family about like the O.J. Simpson trial or like the Rodney King race riots in LA, it was like this really weird situation for my parents, because it's like we're asking them like what's going on, and they were trying to explain things in a race neutral way that clearly like didn't work in those scenarios. And so I think they were completely unprepared and didn't really have the tools to even talk about things that were like obviously happening in the world in a substantial way. But that also left me really unprepared to like address things, you know, as I continued to get older. So I thought that might just be something that people might be curious to hear.
Thank you so much. I have a feeling that that's that's a very common experience. I know that you could, that is mine too. And I did a little shake when you talked about the Rodney King situation, because I was actually living in Los Angeles at that time and teaching school. And the school I was teaching in was right outside the boundary of where the schools were closed. And it was a traumatic experience for me because this is before cell phones, and we got completely cut off communication wise. So like that's a visceral experience for me because I lived it, and I'm still trying to unpack what happened there. And because I was raised in a home where literally it would turn to whispers, and literally any description of a person who was not white was, if they were a police officer, they were a Black police officer or a Chinese police officer, but if they were white, they were just a police officer, right? And so we absorb what we're brought up in. And so we have to be really intentional about looking into this. And so I appreciate what you have to say about that, because yeah, our parents didn't have the tools, because their parents didn't have the tools. Especially if we are white. And me, my mom is first generation because her parents are both Italian immigrants. And so if you're in a family of immigrants or had, very close to a generation of immigrants in your family, there's a whole nother set of ideas that you bring into the learning space. So yes, I think that's what this workshop, what I'm hoping here is not to give you all the answers, but to start you on the path to finding them for yourself, and to test the waters and to try some of these things. One of the barriers that I personally have bumped up against is this norm of having to know everything before I go out and say or do anything. So for example, having to really understand everything about a situation surrounding race before I take action or dig into it. And I got called out on that in a project one time because the person was like, just do it. You have enough information. If you use knowing everything as your bar that you have to reach, you're letting perfection get in the way of getting anything done. And so what I'm going to invite you to do is to be vulnerable to making mistakes and to do your best to mitigate harm. So do the research, but don't expect to be an expert before you jump into these conversations. And it can be helpful to do it in a group of folks who share a lot of your cultural identity and your privilege. For example, some of the best conversations to get me started on this happened in the summer of 2020, when a group of my friends were like, we don't understand what's going on. We really want to talk about it, but we don't know where to go. And we literally ended up sitting in my backyard because we were outside. We didn't have vaccines or anything yet, but this was turned into white ladies in the backyard talking about race. And that's kind of funny, but it's kind of not, because it was a space in which we could ask questions without causing harm to our friends who may have been traditionally marginalized or oppressed in the past, and doing our own work the best that we could. So I encourage you to find groups in which you can ask the questions that you need to ask without causing harm to others or putting extra labor onto your colleagues who are always being asked to answer these questions. We have about 8 or 9 minutes left. I just wanted to see, are there any other comments or questions? I have just a couple more things to share, but I want to give you that space. Okay, well, stop me if you have something that comes to mind. So I'm going to wrap it up. We only got a chance to do one batch of conversations, but I hope that you'll take that experience with you into your workplace, into your classrooms, and try some of this. So within these slides are embedded some resources. I showed you the links to the books earlier. This right here will take you to a list of conversation starters. And this right here is a folder. I'm going to share that with you. You'll see this. This is a lot of the material that I used in developing this talk. And if there's one thing that you explore, because a lot of these are scholarly journal articles, but they're really, really engaging and easy to read. This work, let's see, this resource here is it was called Teaching for Tolerance. It's now Learning for Justice. This is a really practical handbook for facilitating these conversations. And it's a lot of what we talked about here, but it's in a format that you can just like open up the book and, go through the activity. So it literally gives you guidelines. It's really, I think it would be great to use with pre-service teachers. And so please check out these resources. That's why I put them here in the slides. If you are here as part of a group, I would encourage you to set up a way to be accountable. Those of you from Pennsylvania, there's a really amazing organization called Building Anti-Racist White Educators, BARWE, BARWE. Just Google that. That group has monthly questions and readings that you can use as conversation starters in a cohort of people who are interested in learning more, who want to practice this. And I would just say, again, practice, practice, practice. And this is a chart that was in the Milner article that I referenced. And here are some things that are, these are great journal prompts. How do I know? I've used them. And there they are. They showed up in this article. But these are the kinds of things I ask my own students to reflect on. And I would encourage you to consider, if you are a university supervisor working one-on-one, or if you're teaching an introduction class, or you have future educators, either use these as journaling prompts, and if you can't do written prompts, use them as conversation starters. And so I encourage you to dive a little deeper into this here. You can reach me at this email. This is not my school email because I work at 2 different colleges. It gets a little confusing. I will drop the links in the chat for the slides and the resources here in just a moment. I only ask that if you do use parts of my presentation, if you could just give me credit like you would give credit to someone whose material you're using in a research paper or something like that. So I will drop those into the chat in just a moment. And I just gonna stop sharing that. Does anybody have any questions or comments or I see that one of you has asked for a certificate. If you can, I think you've given me your email. I can send kind of a note. I don't have an official certificate made up, but I will certainly take care of that for the student who reached out to me. These links right here should hopefully all work for you. And if you have any questions or want to hang out, please do. Otherwise, I just really appreciate your time. I know it's a long workshop. There's a longer format today, but I'm happy. I love to learn from others and to hear your perspectives. And yeah, so I just thank you for being here, and you're welcome to stay. Otherwise, I think we can wrap it up. I'm going to stop the recording.